Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Ream Library. I'm Tom Landy. I direct the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. And one of the most important aspects of the center's mission is a responsibility for fostering dialogue that's interreligious and intercultural. Through the generosity of the late Jacob and Frances Hyatt and Robert and Myra Kraft, the son-in-law and daughter of the Hyatts, the college has been really fortunate to have significant resources dedicated specifically to teaching about Judaism and to advancing the many-faceted dialogue on Jewish-Christian understanding. The Kraft-Hyatt Fund has enabled us to send faculty to Jerusalem to study the Holocaust at Yad Vashem, to send students in the summer to the Rothberg International School at Hebrew University, to host an international visiting Kraft-Hyatt Fellow, and to bring distinguished speakers on Jewish-Christian relations. You can learn more about our past talks, and you'll see tonight's talk on our website, holycross.edu/McFarland Center. That's a warning that you'll be taped, and if you ask a silly question, it'll be on YouTube or something in a few days. If you ask a good question, though, it'll be on YouTube in a few days, and you can go viral. So how's that? Today, we're really pleased to welcome Jonathan Brumberg-Kraus for a talk on the meals in early Jewish Christian traditions. A Reconstructionist rabbi, Jonathan is professor and chair of religion and coordinator of Jewish studies at Wheaton College, where, for the past 15 years, he's taught a first-year undergraduate seminar on the rituals of dinner, which culminates in a sustainable banquet. Jonathan's written extensively on food and the religious and cultural rituals involving food. He contributes regularly to the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery. He's been on the steering committee of the Meals in the Greco-Roman World seminar of the Society of Biblical Literature, and has contributed to the seminar's forthcoming publication, Meals in Early Judaism, Social Formation at the Table. He translated into English the Shulchan Shel Thank you, I meant to ask you that before. A 14th century handbook on Jewish table ethics and etiquette. And he's the author of the forthcoming book, More Than Kosher, which looks both at what Jewish sacred traditions prescribe about food and meals and what Jews actually eat and think about them. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Brumberg-Kraus.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's a delight to be the guest at Holy Cross, and I've enjoyed the people that I've met here so far. I talk about meals and religion. Oh yeah, okay. Is that good? You can see me, you can see that. Okay, so I am going to be talking about, because it's seasonal, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the upcoming Jewish and Christian meal-centered holidays, Passover and Easter. And I'm going to talk a little bit, though, about the traditions of how meals are used in both Judaism and Christianity, especially from these the early first century traditions, how they use metaphors of meals to describe and to depict and perhaps even reenact experiences of God. So, without further ado, food that divides, food that unites, food metaphors for the experience of the divine in Jewish and Christian tradition. Meals and religion. Okay, so first of all, there are many different ways to look at how religions work, but I find meals a particularly exciting and interesting way to see how people gather together socially to do things religiously. So one of the great interpreters of religion, Ninian Smart, comments in his book Worldviews about the importance of meals in religious celebration, religious ritual, and religious communities. Again, consider how we often celebrate events through a banquet. Meals express a certain kind of togetherness. So think of different meals that you've just had, or some of you have just had a meal, about how this does kind of express some kind of togetherness. There's something about sharing something around the same table in the same place, the same food, that makes a group feel like it's doing something together. But the other thing, too, is that there's a strong tradition of meals and drink being an opportunity for reflection. People eat and then they like to talk about it. Particularly Jewish people like to talk about eating. But we are not the only. I don't know if any of you have read, there's a wonderful book one of the best food books written, Why Italians Love to Talk About Food. Anyone ever read that? Okay, excellent book. Look it up, because that is another cultural tradition in which talking about food is as important as eating it. So anyway, it's very clear that meals are deeply symbolic, that they are very resonant, they have powerful emotional impacts. So given that religions are social events, given that religions are social and bring people together in social ways, and given that religions often deploy rituals to affect certain kinds of religious experiences, and given that meals are powerful emotional experiences, you can see why meals play such an important role in religion. So, this doesn't quite fit in here. So, one of the things that I really like to look at that both is a tradition that both Jews and Christians share from the Hebrew Bible of metaphors for meals and food as ways of experiencing God. And one of the what I've enumerated here are several of some of the more interesting metaphors that one finds in the Hebrew Bible for that use particularly taste as a way of imagining a certain kind of experience. For example, there's a line from the book of Job, which is, truly the ear tests words as the palate tastes food. Now, this quote actually is a lot more meaningful if you know what the context is. Job has, people are familiar with the book of Job, right? Okay. But basically, Job has had all these misfortunes brought upon him by God allowing Satan to bring them upon him as a kind of test. But the best part of these misfortunes are Job's friends coming and telling him, it's all your fault. You're a terrible person. You must have done something terribly wrong. And Job is like saying, I didn't do anything. What's going on here? And it's after about 12 chapters of this, of his friends telling him that Job says to his friends, truly the ear tests words as the palate tastes food. So you could guess what those words taste like. Not so good. But then there's a Song of Songs, which has much more pleasant references. Before I even move on to that, though, you also notice that you have this mixed metaphor. The ear tests words as the palate tastes food, that we experience these words both as taste and and through hearing. So that's important. Note all of these ways that the Bible likes to mix metaphors. Song of Songs is particularly adept at mixing metaphors for sense perception and drawing from the register of all five senses. For example, the very first line, the Song of Songs by Solomon, kiss me with the kisses of your mouth, for your love is sweeter than wine. Your ointments yield a sweet fragrance, your name like the finest oil. Okay, this is going to be an interactive presentation, so you tell me, what are the sense registers being drawn upon here? How is the speaker here experiencing love? Through what senses? All right, let's try kisses. Okay, let's go right to the... what senses do we use with kisses that make kisses pleasurable? Touch. Okay, they're with your mouth. So anything else? Taste, maybe even sound if you're a particularly messy kisser. But clearly touch and taste, and also taste. Well, it's not just any kind of taste. I mean, is it good taste or bad taste? Sweeter than wine. Now, also, wine has another effect, does it not? And love, some may say that love might have that same effect too. Is it wine and love might be a little intoxicating, right? Okay, so we got that. Now, what about your ointments yield a sweet fragrance? Your name is like finest oil. Any other references to the sensory register? Which smell? Yes, obviously, the fragrance. And anything else? Sound, exactly. Where's sound? Okay, now, those of you who are Hebrew scholars will realize that in the Hebrew there is a pun here. The Hebrew word for oil is shemen, and what is the Hebrew word for name? Amy. Shem. No, I'm not putting you, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I thought you took Hebrew with me, though, didn't you? All right. Never mind. My bad. Okay, so there's a in case we don't get the sense that there's also, that they're clearly drawing on sound register as well as the smell register. There's a pun on smell and on basically what you smell and what you hear. Or we have a whole litany of the senses in verses 5:1. I have come into my garden, my sister, my bride. I have smelled my myrrh and spice, eaten my honey and honeycomb, drink my wine and my milk. Eat, lovers, and drink deep of love. Okay, again, we've got taste and we've got smell. Probably we've got touch too, because taste itself is actually kind of a multi-sensory experience anyway. I mean, when you taste something, there's mouthfeel, there's also the smell. Most of the things we taste is half smell anyway. You all done an experiment, I guess. Have any of you done the experiment where like you hold your nose and you eat an apple or you eat an onion? You can't tell the difference, they say. Okay. Another great metaphor that is particularly picked up on in Christian poetic and song tradition is taste and see that the Lord is sweet. In Hebrew, it's literally good, tov, but it's very interesting in the Latin translations. It's suave, and that's an interpretation. That there is some kind of sense that the sight of the Lord is somehow sweet, which raises very interesting questions too. That neuroscientists would tell us is that not everybody tastes things the same way. So sweet may be sweet, but what one person tastes as sweet, another person may taste in a different kind of way. Also, some people don't even taste everything on the register. But that being said, it's very clear that we usually associate sweet with something as a taste that we like, as opposed to something that's bitter that we often want to just spit right out. Okay? Make sense? Because we like sweets, right? All right. Okay. Now, this next line, which is one of my favorite lines in the Bible, and I actually have it posted on my office door. It might not look like a metaphor at first, but it actually, or synaesthetic metaphor at first, but it actually is. So, in the way that the tradition interprets it. So, the Israelite elders at Mount Sinai had a vision of God and they ate and drank. Now, that seems like sequential, right? They had a vision of God and then they ate and drank. But the Jewish mystics can't accept words at face value, and they decided that actually don't read it as they had a vision of God and then ate and drank, but they had a vision of God and ate and drank. That was the same thing. That their vision of God was as palpable as eating and drinking, and in fact, the Midrashic Jewish interpretive tradition says that's real eating, it's a vision, and in fact, the Hebrew word for that's used isn't the normal word for seeing. It's the word that's used associated vayachazu, chazon, with prophetic vision. Suggests that a prophetic vision is not only something that you see that's a vision from God, but it's something that's very, very palpable. Something that's so strong that you can like taste it. And finally, there are ways in which these metaphors are deployed. These mixed metaphors are deployed even in ritual, which I'll come back to that point. But there's a line from Exodus. They made their life bitter, vayimarareru in Hebrew, for them with harsh labor at mortar and bricks. So bitter, what register does bitter come from? Taste. And yet they weren't like feeding them bitter things when they were probably hitting them with whips. So they're using a taste metaphor for a touch thing. But the other thing that's kind of interesting too is the sound. Is the sound of the word. The word for embittered is actually a very mellifluous word, mararu. Okay? And many people would say that M sounds and R sounds are actually very pleasant to hear. So there's a very kind of interesting thing going on here. So when you say this, you're describing something that you want to spit out. That's something that's repellent, but at the same time, the sound is actually not so repellent. Interesting little paradox there, isn't it? Okay? So I mention this point for all of these because I think one of the things that's very characteristic of biblical use of taste metaphors, I'm going somewhere with this, so bear with me, is that it likes to mix them because it seems to feel that they're particularly using in powerful experiences like love or some kind of direct experience of God, is something that hits you with more than one sense. And so they use metaphors that are mixed. One might call these synaesthetic metaphors. Metaphors, obviously they mix the senses. Is anyone here synaesthetic? If you are, you'd know it. Okay, so there is a neurological condition that people have in which they can experience several senses at one time. For example, the most typical one is that people can see sounds. Any of you have ever seen Fantasia? That seems to be kind of a cinematic representation of seeing the way that Walt Disney's animators imagined that sounds look like. Richard Seidowitz wrote a very interesting book about a particularly interesting synesthete who actually experienced like almost all of these. So he would see, taste, and feel things at the same time. And Seidowitz describes going to having meals with this particular person, and he said, this doesn't feel right. But he's looking at the colors. Or when he's combining things, he says, this doesn't look right. But he doesn't mean like it doesn't look right. He's smelling it and seeing that the colors don't go right. And the other thing that was very interesting about this, just an aside, is that you might think that having this heightened sensory awareness is a good thing. It actually is kind of, at least with interviews with a lot of synesthetes, it's difficult because it's kind of like sensory overload. At the same time, Seidowitz discovered that people had a strong emotional attachment to this experience, and he did some experiments where he was able to basically give them a certain kind of drug that made them not sense everything at the same time, and they felt really they were very upset and until they got it back. The other thing that's very interesting about synesthesia is that many of the great creative thinkers and composers and artists were synesthetes. I know that Nabokov was synesthetic. I think I'm trying to. Has anyone come across this? Okay. Well, anyway, there are many people who were quite creative. I think Kandinsky also was synesthetic. So, but that's not how I'm using them. I'm using, the other linguists use synesthetic metaphors to talk about certain kinds of experiences that people have in which they do mix, or language that they use to talk about mixed metaphors. And it's interesting, we have terms like this. Like, for example, what's a loud color? Right, but what's loud about it? It's hard to describe, but you know that that's what it is. Or we talked about sweet sounds. And, again, what makes a sound sweet? Maybe there are certain kinds of neurological chemical reactions in our brains that are similar in when we hear or taste certain things. But be that as it may, one of the things that the linguist asks is this cross-cultural? I mean, that is in, our colors, our loud colors, is loud mean something like red in any language? And the evidence, the evidence is still out on that. But one of the person, for those of you who are interested in kind of celebrity psychologists, it's Simon Baron-Cohen, the brother of Sacha Baron-Cohen, who's done a lot of work on linguistic synesthesia. Okay, but anyway, my point is that the Bible uses synesthetic metaphors to describe special experiences. Of course, the greatest kind of body of a lot of this material that both Jews and Christians, especially Jewish and Christian mystics, love to go back to is the Song of Songs, because the Song of Songs is rich in this imagery. I already alluded to that. But at the same time, there's also a tradition in both Christian and Jewish tradition that the poetic account of lovers is actually an allegory of the relationship between believers and God. And so this kind of recognition that heightened experiences of love between two lovers is comparable to the heightened experiences that people have with God, it makes sense to draw metaphors from Song of Songs to talk about mystical experiences. So that you find that both in Jewish and Christian traditions. Oops. The other thing, too, is that people love to illustrate these things. And so, for example, this is this is from a 13th or 14th century illuminated Haggadah, Passover Haggadah. The Passover Haggadah is from Spain. This is the Sarajevo Haggadah. Would actually, before they even got into the liturgy of the Passover Seder, they would often retell the whole biblical story, at least up to the Exodus, in kind of pictures. One might presume, well, was it because the audience wasn't literate, or was it to enhance? It probably wasn't because the audience wasn't literate, because almost all of the pictures always have captions in Hebrew telling what's going on underneath. What's more likely is that they're efforts to do some kind of modern interpretation, well, what was modern at their time, interpretation of an updating of the events for them, and or what some people might call as a kind of visual midrash, a visual interpretation that updates things. So it's interesting. You see this depiction of the receiving of the Torah on Mount Sinai and the Israelites receiving the manna. The people are not wearing ancient Near Eastern clothes. They're wearing medieval clothes. They're dressed like medieval stuff. But that's not why I brought you this picture. It's that the tradition, the visual tradition itself, likes to associate the receiving of the Torah from Mount Sinai with the receiving of the manna from the sky, and the mystical tradition associates those two events with this phrase, they had a vision of God and ate and drank, and that's actually why probably this illumination juxtaposes the picture of the Israelites gathering manna on the right side with the Moses getting the Torah, Mount Sinai. So just kind of visual suggestion that eating things coming from God is a lot like receiving revelation from God. Here's another piece of another example of illuminations. Again, trying to connect the sight with the sound, and also this is part of a liturgical text that you would use at a Passover Seder. This is a picture of the maror. Okay, so some are going to object and say that's not what maror looks like. And it doesn't look. Maror should look like a dirty brown root. But that's the exception to the rule. In most Jewish tradition until Eastern Europe, the maror was a bitter green vegetable, and it's almost always depicted in that in illuminated Haggadah. This one I think is, I'm pretty sure this one from the John Rylands Haggadah, around Spanish Haggadah from around the same period as the Sarajevo one. But things like endive or chicory or that kind of flavor, that's what you would be eating. And by the way, these greens are very typical of first century and later Israeli and Palestinian diet, because you can forage for these. They're also like poor people food. They're very easy to get. You don't have to. They grow wild, and in times of famine, greens are a good way, are a good form of sustenance. Not that satisfying, but they do feed you. So why do what is the added value of a synaesthetic metaphor in to convey the experience of the divine? Or what is it actually communicating? And so if I try to unpack that, this is what we would get. First of all, if you're going to say that that experience of love or of God is like tasting, seeing, and touching, and all at the same time, it's drawing on the idea that it's a special kind of experience. It's a multi-sensories experience. There's a kind of sensory overload. But another possibility of it being a multi-sensories experience is that when you combine these different things, you can actually experience a coincidence of opposites. So, for example, you can taste bitter and sweet at the same time, or you can taste bitter and hear sweet at the same time, like in the word maror. Or all of the possibilities are endless. But basically, I think that there are conscious efforts to do this, and I'll come back to this point. But the reason why I make this point is that that what is sometimes logically impossible to hold together is not sensorily impossible to hold together because we do it all the time. And in fact, we often find these combinations of things that shouldn't go together actually kind of quite pleasant when they go together. And I will come up with some obvious examples later. Secondly, if you're using sense metaphors drawing both sight and, let's say, taste, you're suggesting that that the experience is something like bringing near what is sensed from afar. So tasting and seeing, tasting and hearing. And some people might say, well, that's what it's like to experience the divine or God, because God is both far away in heaven, but at the same time, it's almost like you can taste God. God is that close. Make sense? Okay. So it's trying, but it wants to preserve that idea that it's both, that there's this kind of paradoxical both. Also, tasting and seeing or hearing are a kind of knowing. Like the real eating in the Jewish mystical interpretation of that passage from Exodus, or also like the tradition of interpreting, a kind of Christian interpretation in Latin of sapere as being associated with sapientia, okay, to savor something. Our word savor is related to sapor, but that is basically, perhaps some of our most fundamental knowledge about the world around us is through our senses. We make our snap judgments, particularly, there are arguments that people make about our snap moral judgments coming probably from the taste experience of disgust. That we automatically want to spit out something that tastes bitter, but the physiology of the experience of bitterness is actually not all that different from what it feels like to find something morally repugnant. And we scrunch up our faces in the same way, more or less. And people have drawn connections to that. Also, synaesthetic metaphors enable us to play with the multiple meanings of good. When we say something, we know what we mean when something tastes good, which actually, even though different people taste different things differently at different times or hear things different in different ways, we kind of do have a sense of what is good to us and to us personally or to us in a certain cultural setting. But you can combine these. You can send, when you say taste the Lord and see that He is good, you're saying a lot of things. You're saying maybe that there's something about the experience is actually pleasurable in the same way that like taste and touch pleasures are good, but also that God is morally good, or also knowing God. There's we say that's a good point. We talk about conceptual coherence as being good too, and so when we're doing this, we're able to make associations between certain kinds of pleasurable physical experiences and moral and conceptual experience. Does that make sense to people? So again, because they want you to mix these things. The whole idea of a mixed metaphor is they want you to mix stuff up. Okay? So now, one question I had, neuroscientists have suggested there is a relationship between taste for bitterness and moral disgust. Actually, Andrea, this is stuff that, Korsmeyer talks about. She has a whole book on disgust. And I had a question, which I asked one of the people who studies this, Jonathan Haidt, who's someone who I like his work a lot. If there's a comparable relationship between our attraction for sweet tasting things and sort of what happens neurologically when you experience what he calls the elevating emotions of like admiration and gratitude. It's possible. I asked him. He said, "Good idea. I wonder. Let's try it out." Or I don't know. Actually, he didn't. Really. I wish he said. He and his students set up these great experiments. So those of you who are interested in finding out this stuff, read it. Read anything by Jonathan Haidt. He's very interesting. Finally, synaesthetic metaphors do stress that they often talk about tasting something that's bitter. Which is interesting too, because that is possible that experiences of love or of the divine, two very positive experiences, often have something about the bitter in them. Those of you who are familiar with the book of Revelation, John of Patmos is told to eat the scroll, and it tastes sweet at first, and then it doesn't. Then it tastes bitter. So bitterness is kind of part of tasting God. All right. So now we get to some visuals. Okay. So not only does the religious language of sacred religious texts associate these things, but there are ways in which religious rituals of Jewish and Christian tradition actually try to have us act them out. So I think they're still trying to have us achieve this kind of synaesthetic experience, but it's by basically saying these things but also doing them, because saying them and doing them at the same time is really important. And actually that's one of the reasons why the Greek and Roman philosophers at symposia thought that was such a good occasion to teach over meals, is because you would be talking about things that you would be learning about things that you were directly experiencing. And similarly, the rabbis picked that up in the Passover and the organization of the Passover Seder. So here we have some examples of some visual examples of religious rituals that are intended to create synaesthetic experiences. This is a 20th century forgery of a painting of the meal at Emmaus, the last meal in Luke's gospel, in which Jesus appears to some of his disciples, and they know him by the breaking of the bread. I'll say a little bit more about that. But there's a depiction of that. And here is a picture from one of the illuminated Haggadahs of people ritualizing the synaesthetic experiences of the Passover Seder. Okay? So in Christian tradition, this is you definitely have a kind of example of a representation of a synaesthetic experience of God in this account at the end of Luke's gospel. I won't read it aloud because that's the point of a PowerPoint, is that you can see it. However, I will call your attention to the disciples saying to him, to Jesus, who at first they didn't recognize him. Were our hearts not burning within us while he was talking? So there's a kind of, that's actually a different kind of sense feeling, that when you can feel something from the inside, the burning on the inside. But also, he was made known to them. There are several places where it says he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Okay, well, what does that mean? So, there are lots of different ways that one could take that. I'm kind of interested a little bit in how some of the great painters in the Western tradition understood what that means. So here we have Rembrandt, a painting by Rembrandt of that meal. And what do you think? By looking at the visuals in that? What do you think he means by Jesus being made known in the breaking of the bread? This is the interactive part, another interactive part of the talk. What do you see? Or what do they know about him? I mean, maybe that's one of the things that Rembrandt seems to want to emphasize. Well, what do you see when you see here? Does Jesus look different from the other characters in the... yes. Okay. What's distinctive? The light coming from behind him. So he's somehow special. The other things too, so what about this light? Does the light just stay on him? Yeah, there's something reflective, or the light can be sort of transferred in a certain kind of way. So that's an important part to him too. So the light of Jesus, which presumably is coming from where? God, yeah, is also getting kind of carried over into the table. I mean, Rembrandt loves playing with light, and he's certainly well known for that. And so first of all, do you see any bread there? Yeah, it's hard to see. There might be some. Yeah, it does look a little bit like he's holding it, but that's certainly not the focus of the picture. I mean, that's not the focus of the image. The image, your attention is called to him and his person, and the actual, and pretty much the table. I mean, if that was your dinner table, you'd be a little upset, wouldn't you? I mean, there's not much there. Okay, so so what they know about Jesus is kind of not very material. And it seems like it's very much stressing the visual element in here. There's something different and special and bright and divine about Jesus, but it's mostly they know it through what they see. Okay, so that's that. Now compare that to Caravaggio's image of the same meal at Emmaus. Again, what do you think Caravaggio might have a different idea about what it means to know Jesus through the breaking of his bread, the breaking of the bread? All right, so what's different about the picture? Yes, first of all, that's a real meal, okay? So, I mean, I'm biased. I happen to think that God is much more likely to be revealed at a full table than at an empty one. But yes, so it's definitely a full table. There's lots of food at the table. What else? What do you mean? The what? Oh, yeah. The chair actually is kind of nicer.
Yeah, like the other ones are kind of just like made.
You certainly don't pay much attention to them. Yeah, that's true. It's a very, very nice crafted chair. What about the relationship of the people to Jesus in the image? Yeah, they're closer. Right. You can't see. There's certainly you have some of the light that's kind of Rembrandt-y, so probably, well, who knows? Yes. So it's not like the light is, it's not like Jesus is the light source. And also, if you look at the other characters, it seems like, light seems a little bit reflected in, some of their coloring. You could probably make the same case for the Rembrandt picture too, but they're so much closer that it seems like some of the light is kind of at least reflecting in the guy on his right, and also in their clothes and the colors of their clothes. Anything else that seems different about it in terms of maybe the movement and the. And the one on in Caravaggio's, none of them. Yeah, they seem to be eating and also in animated conversation. And it's like, and does Jesus look like he's teaching anything, or like he's making a point? Yeah, definitely. And Caravaggio definitely looks like he's making a point. And if you go back to the Luke passage, it says that one of the ways that they knew him is because he explained what the scriptures meant, that it was all about him. So it actually describes him teaching. So there was a kind of teaching component at the table. And so I think that's something that Caravaggio really picks up on in that, is that if they did know him in the breaking of the bread, it might have had something to do with what he said. It wasn't just like seeing, rays of light coming out of his head. Does that make sense? Okay, but all of this, I'm pointing this out because I'm very interested in kind of the interpretive tradition. How do people understand? How do people in certainly the Christian artistic tradition? How do they understand what it means to know Jesus in the breaking of the bread? But even Caravaggio is of mixed minds on this. He does this painting several times, and he does it differently. This is the painting. This is a version that he did of the Meal at Emmaus in 1601, he did this one in 1606. So, which raised a question for me as I looked at these two pictures: is the breaking of the bread? Does one know Jesus in the breaking of the bread, or is it in the story? And does Caravaggio seem to have a different position on this based on these two depictions? Well, first of all, let's see. Do we see anything different about the second, the later painting that he did? Yes, which is very interesting. There's a woman involved. Also, the orientation of the pictures, it's on this side and not on the other side. The lighting is. What do you see different about the lighting? And do we see any of the lighting reflected on more than Jesus' face? You don't think so? Not on the guy's forehead and on the woman's forehead? So there's some of that. What about the table spread? much less. In fact, what's on the table? And? Okay. Any thoughts at Holy Cross, what that might mean? Yes, it's any particular ritual? Okay. So there seems to be a kind of more explicit reference to understanding that Jesus might have performed something like communion at the meal at Emmaus, which many interpreters feel that's what that phrase means. But doesn't seem to be the point that Caravaggio was making in the first painting. It was something about the meal itself, that there was something about the camaraderie, the instruction, the closeness, and so on. It also seems a little bit more dynamic in this than that, but still, unlike the Rembrandt picture, there's definitely something about the communalness of this. I mean, these people are crowded around Jesus. So much for Christian tradition. Okay, how about Jewish tradition? This idea of experiencing God at the rituals of the table. Well, there's one of my favorite passages is a passage in the Mishnah that talks about, that basically says, whenever three are gathered at the table and say words of Torah about the table, over the table. Well, actually, it says about the table. No, actually, it says over the table. Whenever three say words of Torah over the table, the God's present. Then it contrasts that to when three are gathered to eat a meal and don't say words of Torah. It's as if there were sacrifices to the dead and like vomit. I mean, it actually uses a passage from Isaiah that is pretty disgustingly graphic. So it's better to say words of Torah because that somehow brings the divine presence there. So they developed this whole tradition in a Jewish tradition of eating and reading. I don't know how common this is in other traditions, but Jews often take for granted that we get together for a Shabbat meal. We have a little book that we read a blessing for. We have a little bencher after the meal. We go to the Passover Seder. We take out a book. I mean, even my family, we have to do a reading for Thanksgiving that's on a piece of paper of a last speech that JFK gave before he was assassinated. But we have to take out a piece of paper. Now, I've talked to other people, and Jews are not the only people who do that. There are other people who have these family traditions, and certainly there's a tradition, kind of the monastic tradition, where people will be dining and someone will be reading from Scripture during the meal, or reading from other things. I've heard people read. I interviewed somebody about this, and he was telling me, a priest was telling me about, sometimes they read from boring histories and all kinds of things. But there is some kind of sense that reading something over a meal is a way of elevating the meal, particularly if you're saying things. Now, what I think that this passage in the Mishnah is suggesting is that it's even better, though, to say words that actually say something about the table, because you make these kinds of interesting associations if you're saying words of Torah about the table, over the table. And in fact, you can translate the Hebrew, and I choose to translate it this way, to mean both. I mean, because the word for over and about in Hebrew, al, it's the same word. And so there is, and that comes out of the sympathetic tradition, which says that the appropriate thing, one should talk about over the table things that have to do with the table. Another way that synaesthetic experiences are ritualized at the Passover Seder is what I called it. Well, I don't call it. Everybody calls it this, the Hillel sandwich. Okay, so let me tell you about the Hillel sandwich. I mean, people like to joke that Jews invented sandwiches. It's not true. But it was the Earl of Sandwich who at least invented the thing that's called a sandwich. But at the Passover Seder, there is a part in which we take the symbolic foods of the Seder that earlier in the Seder we say, Rabbi Gamliel says, whoever does not say the matzah and the bitter herb, the maror, and the Passover offering has not fulfilled the obligation of the Passover Seder. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about that passage is it doesn't say whoever doesn't eat that, it's whoever doesn't say that, because we don't do Passover lamb sacrifice offerings anymore. But be that as it may, hold that in your head, because then shortly after Rabbi Gamliel says that in the liturgy, it says in the Seder, and now to commemorate, and this is the last thing you do, you know you're going to get to eat pretty soon when we get to this part, is now we come to the Seder, and Rabbi Hillel used to do, it was the custom of Rabbi Hillel that he would take 2 pieces of matzah and a piece of bitter herb, and he would put it together with the Passover lamb, and he would eat it in memory of what it said how to observe the Passover in the Bible. So now what Jews do is that they take they make this Hillel sandwich, which is of course made out of matzah and bitter herb and lamb, right? No, there's no lamb because there's no temple anymore to sacrifice lambs. So it's leave that minor detail that we don't have a temple anymore to sacrifice lambs, and that God, at least according to the story, expelled us from the land for being bad, and that we're in exile until 1948. But be that as it may, we eat the sandwich that we do with Hillel, and we're combine these flavors, and instead of the lamb, it's become customary to use this charoset. Let's see if we're doing. Yeah, so I have to pay attention to time too. Okay, so we have charoset, which is this sweet-tasting apple or apple date, and actually tastes a little bit like the flavor registers a little bit like the wine we had. Some of us had at dinner tonight. So it's very sweet tasting. You combine that with the bitter tasting thing, and you make this Hillel sandwich. And so you actually get to eat a sandwich that tastes, has the taste of opposites. Okay, a bitter and sweet. Okay, and in a way it makes the bitter sweet. In the case we don't get that point clearly when we do. So we're saying this, and we're also evoking this historical basically, we're celebrating the story of redemption, but there's a certain undercurrents of unredemption in the Passover Seder that one could overlook. But so, nevertheless, we put together and taste and feel. And I mean, has anyone ever made a Hillel sandwich? I mean, it's a very palpable experience. It's fun. Play with your food and eat that. Okay, so what does it mean? This is a great interpretation by a Hasidic master who basically says that that these things are a way in which we actually do reconcile in our mouths, in a sense, these historical experiences of God being both nice and not so nice. And that so when swallowing the bitter herb, we won't feel the taste of the bitter herb more than the matzah, but the bitter herb is sweetened. That there's actually a kind of mystical process of sweetening the bad tasting or repellent tasting aspects of both the maror literally and of kind of Jewish historical experience figuratively. And here's the thing, is that you're able to juxtapose the pleasant taste with the not so pleasant taste. And the pleasant literal taste with the not so pleasant historical experiences. And so this is a way in which you get a kind of sense, even if mentally and cognitively it's problematic to hold that God is both the source of life and death, of pain and of pleasure. At the same time, you have tasted something like that, and it does put them together. And so it kind of gives you a sense of deep faith or certitude that it's possible. It could happen in some kind of way, at least on a subconscious level. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm getting to the end. Okay. All right. So clearly eating is a way of knowing. It's a multisensory, context-driven experience, and which you're paying it. And the reason why I say that is because there's a kind of way in which it unifies experiences. If you're paying attention to your context when you're eating, you suddenly see, oh, everything goes together. The people I'm with, the things that I'm eating, all of this stuff. It feels like this kind of whole. The mouth does process information. And in particular, bitterness shadows the pleasures of every bite and vice versa. And not only that, I give you some good examples of things that involve the taste of bitter and sweet that are things that make life worth living. Okay? Like really good bitter chocolate, although not everybody likes bitter chocolate. The Hillel sandwich, and of course, Guinness. Okay. Tasting flavors involves eating stories, and therefore makes us more mindful of the stories that we carry. So again, it's a way of connecting what we're saying with what we're doing. We use our knowledge about flavor and emotion, these associations, to compose kind of recipes for food and rituals that pack powerful emotional experiences of the good life. That's important. That's why meals work religiously, is because they can do this. And we can, and not only do they do this, you can do this. We made up, you can make a dinner, you can make a Thanksgiving dinner, you can make, you have the capacity to do this if you aim at the right targets. You can create these kinds of experiences that many people associate with the holy. The other thing, just as, I like to always put the science piece in here because I like to belie the fact that people who do religious studies don't like science. I love science. I love cognitive neuroscience. I love biology and all this, the connections. Is that the Bible, or for those who wish to see things in purely secular terms, culture and myth, and evolutionary biology seem to agree that we have a taste for what is good for us, whether we sacralize it as God's design or as natural selection. And that's why I'm talking about bitter and sweet, is that there's a reason why we associate moral good, intellectual good with physical good, because those are things, when we respond to our physiological cues to avoid what is unpleasant or to consume what is pleasant, it's good for us, usually, except that we've totally messed, as you know, we've totally messed up and short-circuited our sensory system, so we eat too much sugar, fat, and salt. But be that as it may, if things were right, we'd be better off. Okay, so any of you ever seen Babette's Feast? Okay, best food movie ever. Sadly, the director of the movie, Gabriel Axel, died this year, but he basically, in Isaac Denison's short story and in Gabriel Axel's representation of it, he dramatizes exactly the power of the physicality, the sensuality of meals as elevating people. I'm not going to go into the whole story. You can read it. But, I mean, basically the premise of this is that these two women were the daughters, part of this very pious and ascetic religious group in I believe in Denmark. In Denmark, and they lead a very simple life. They feed the poor. That was kind of their mission. Every year they celebrate the anniversary of their I think it's his birthday. Yeah, his death or his birthday. I think it's his birthday. And he wrote hymns and different things like that. And they get sent a refugee from the Paris revolutions who was a great chef. And she wants to repay them by making a banquet for them because she wins the lottery. And so they are terrified because they think if she's bringing in all this wine and turtles, and they have nightmares about like turtle soup or about turtles. And this is a terrible thing because, it's Satan that wants us to experience all this stuff. But somehow her gourmet feast becomes transcendent. Also, there's all kinds of backstories in here. Is that there's a unrequited love that never happened between the sisters. One sister had a beautiful voice, and an opera teacher was recovering his voice and met her and fell in love kind of with her, but kissed her, and that didn't work out because she didn't want to have anything to do with him. He was the one who actually sent Babette to there. And then there was this general who fell in love with the other sister, and she also, because she was married to her vocation, didn't want to have anything to do with him. And the general, who was a kind of wild guy, prodigal son, he went off. He left, and he lived in the world and became a famous general, and he actually ate at Babette's restaurant anyway. So they all come back together at this culminating thing, and so what happens is that these people are transformed. They're against all their expectations, and that's what some of this refers to. And the general gives a wonderful speech, and I'm going to read it because I like the speech. Okay. So because none of the people also swore they weren't going to say anything. That was how they're going to, we're not going to, because one of the things that makes food good is you say, wow, that was really good, but no one's going to say that. because they wanted to withhold the experience of pleasure, but they couldn't help it because they were drinking wine and they had really good food. But the general spoke basically for them. And he said, "We tremble before making our choice in life, and after having made it again, tremble in fear of having chosen wrong. But the moment comes when our eyes are open and we see and realize that grace is infinite. Grace, my friends, demands nothing from us but that we shall await it with confidence and acknowledge it in gratitude. See, that which we have chosen is given to us, and that which we have refused is also, and at the same time, granted to us. Aye, that which we have rejected is poured upon us abundantly, for mercy and truth have met together, and righteousness and bliss have kissed one another." And I choose this quotation because it says in a very poetic way everything that I said what synaesthetic metaphors do. Is they bring opposites together. It's a multi-sensory experience. It's highly sensorily charged. It's pleasurable. And just as an aside, for me, that particular line has a lot of associations, but one association I really like is this. It's a quotation from Psalm 85:10. And for those of you who are Blakeans or like Blake, Blake has a very nice depiction of this. It's very interesting too. Mercy and truth have met together, and righteousness and bliss have kissed one another. They're depicted as angels. I don't know why Blake depicts them as angels, or why, in a sense, I think Isaac Dinesen understands them to be angels in that. But there was a rabbinic midrash that basically portrays them as angels, arguing over whether human beings should be created. So it's a wonderful midrash. The angels lose. God creates people. But one of the lines in it is that that mercy and truth have met together, and righteousness and bliss have kissed one another. And there's one of the things that the midrash picks up on is the word "kissed" can have a double meaning. Nashku means kissed, but it's also the same word that's cognate with neshek, like weapon. And the rabbis interpreted it to mean that the angels were fighting and quarreling. But so it's both quarreling and kissing and making up. Coincidence of opposite. Coincidence? I think not. Okay, so I'm at the end. So I threw out some questions because I like to throw out questions. But I was throwing out questions before too. So we have a little bit of time before unless you're totally exhausted. So you think that the Bible thinks it's thinks it's good that human beings acquire a taste for bitterness? Is bitter always bad? People say the same thing about light and darkness. Is that what? And perhaps our painters have helped us see that contrast is really important in being able to see the light. Can't see the light without the shadow. So you think that's a sort of divine truth? Just a thought. How about pleasures of dining? Do they cause religious experiences, or do they just get in the way? Oh, come on, you have to have something to say about this. Do they always? Okay. When don't they? Well, you haven't been to our Thanksgiving. Yeah, when you eat too much, right? Do you feel miserable afterwards? Or you feel like I'm just doing this, or I have to do all the work for this, and it's miserable, or I miss my.
When people have to come together at Thanksgiving, it's like it always happens. You hear it on the radio, on the TV, or wherever.
I know they're all complaining.
They are all complaining about getting together, and it seems like a negative thing, but it doesn't happen.
Okay, that's why I give this talk. Okay, it's because I know people say that, and people are saying that about Christmas now too. Oh, it's so horrible! It's everything that you have to do because yes, it's been hijacked into all of these obligations that basically miss the point. The point is gathering together with people and doing things to celebrate. And when you are actually celebrating and enjoying the benefits of the work that goes into preparing for them, then the work doesn't seem quite as bad. And I think those of us, again, making dinner for a nice dinner that you're going to share with friends is, and where it's not like this, it doesn't feel as much as a burden. But that's not the way that it's presented to us, and the way that most people experience it in holidays. So, one of the things that I do in my rituals of dinner class is, if you want to carry off a good banquet or a ritual that does something for people, it takes work, but it's kind of worth it if you get the payoff from the people coming together. And so I think that is an important piece. Maybe that's another way of combining another kind of Guinness experience of combining the bitter with the intoxicating. Okay, you want to see my last visual joke? Okay. If the Last Supper was a Passover Seder. Okay, thank you very much. It was a delight to come here.